Well, good morning, and it is a privilege to be here this morning with you and be able to speak. As you can see, I'm not Pastor Rick or Pastor Dan. They are off spending the holiday weekend with family, and they're all going to be back for the holidays coming up. Pastor Rick is especially excited to be back for the holidays. He and Miss Joy are especially excited right now because they are getting to celebrate Emery's third birthday this weekend. So they're having a great time this weekend, and we are going to be here. They're going to be tuning in online. I told Pastor Jared, I said, we should come up with a safe word. And when I say that, we'll just kill the live stream and then we can all head out to lunch and watch some football. He said that was not a good idea, that I needed to stick it out. So we're going to do that this morning. I'm excited to get into the word here this morning. But first, I have some news. If you haven't noticed, we're officially in December. Today's December 1st, and we've made it most of the way, almost all of the way through a year. And with that, it causes us to kind of sit back and think as we have a moment or two that we can breathe a little bit. And we sit back and we look at what it is that we have been through this past year. We made it to this point. That deserves at least a pat on the back. And some of us have been through some incredible things. And there's really a cause for celebration in what you and what I have been through. And some of us have been through some really hard things. We've been through a lot, maybe some things that seemed unimaginable at the time. I mean, I think we all get a little bit of credit. We made it through a political season. Haven't done that in a while, so that's encouraging. There's more to come, but one day at a time, we're going to work through this. We've been through a lot. One of the things that I didn't expect that I was going to be going through this year was I was going to have to face one of my biggest, albeit irrational fears. I was going to have to go through a cave this year. Didn't see that one coming. That wasn't on my bingo card, but I took some students to a camp, and at that camp, they just happened to have a cave. And so I had been spending all of this time this week before I knew about the cave situation, talking about encouraging them and cheering them on as they faced their fears. There was a high ropes course that they had to do. There was different participation in small groups and in games and praying out loud around people and a lot of things that I was just the biggest cheerleader I could possibly be until I found out there was a cave and it was time for my actions to match my words. It's a totally irrational fear. I just don't like being underground and like unstructured ground. It seems a little sketchy to me. And they had this cave and they offered unguided tours. So if spelunking would be fear number one, going in a cave without a tour guide is easily fear number two. But here I am with these middle school students, and it's my turn to make my decision on if I'm going to step up and do that or not. And as pastors here at church, we work on making sure that we're practicing what we're preaching. We keep each other accountable. So that's exactly what I did. I made the decision we're going to go into this cave. I've got a picture of that cave here. So that's the entrance of the cave, and that's the widest point of this cave. And so when I made my decision, we're going to end up going through that. And things went okay. We had to get like single file to get in there. I went ahead and signed up to go last. That way I didn't slow down these guys when I had to stop and take some deep breaths. And I made sure we had another leader with us because I hear it's a traumatic thing for students to have to like drag out their leader who passed out. And so like I put in all the safe stops and made sure that wasn't something that they had to experience. And all in all, it was a pretty good experience until we hit a point where I had a decision to make. We were going through, and I don't know like the range of caves on how big they are, but this one was big enough, or long enough at least, that we hit a spot where there was no more light coming in from the entrance. And that was a point of no return for me. All of a sudden, I can't even see the hand in front of my face, and we were super equipped, and none of us had flashlights, and I'm in my Birkenstocks, and it's like wet and slippery and weird in there, and like it's just crazy in this experience. But I had this decision where I just started to kind of reconsider my big, strong, face my fears moment where well, I'm in the cave, right? Like I didn't talk about how far I would go into this cave. And I mean, these guys, they're going to be proud of me no matter what, right? Like, they're a great group of kids there. And I mean, I could just turn around now. I faced my fear, right? I did it. We took a step into this, but that was the thing is we decided we're going to do this together. We're going to go all the way through it, even though we don't know what's ahead of us. We went all the way to the end. They have it all blocked off where you can't go any further. And I was very okay with that. But we get down to the end of that and we made it through the cave. I came back out. These are my biggest cheerleaders in that experience. And it was quite the experience. It was a fun thing. It was a scary thing. And it was a thing that I didn't expect to go through this year. But that one's kind of a joke. That one's kind of a funny thing. There's a lot of things that we've gone through this year that weren't so funny, that weren't so lighthearted. My family and I, a couple months ago, had a 3-week NICU stay with our son. And for some of that, his future was unknown. We didn't know what things were going to look like for a portion of that. I'm happy to say that he's doing really well. Everything is normal, and one person in our marriage is getting sleep these days. But that's where we're at right now. We've been through some hard things, and so have you. Some of you guys have been through things that may have been earth-shattering, that may have seemed like there was no way out, that seemed like there was no way to see the outcome this year. And maybe you're through it, not unscathed, but you've made it through. You're working on healing. You're working on picking up the pieces. Maybe some of you are sitting here this morning and you're staring it straight in the face. Maybe it's bankruptcy and finances are tight and the holidays aren't exactly bringing cheer to that situation. Maybe you're facing infertility. Maybe your marriage is on its last leg and don't know if you're going to make it through the rest of this year or definitely not through 2025. Maybe you faced divorce this year. Many of you face medical diagnoses and treatments that are big. They're scary. They're painful, unknown situations that we find ourselves in. I hope this morning that this message can bring some hope, some encouragement, some faith to take one more step through these situations. Not necessarily getting to the end and everything being gone and better, but what would it look like to maybe take one more step through all of this? So I'm going to talk about, or we're going to look at a story in Scripture that is probably familiar to a lot of you if you've spent any time in church. And if you're a VeggieTales fan, you'll really probably like the story because it's the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And I want to highlight some things in the way that they took their steps of faith through that. The story starts back in Jerusalem, and Babylon came and took over this area. And they took a bunch of people captive. Especially they took people who were like the strongest and the smartest and the bravest and people that could end up maybe becoming an asset to their empire as well. And so that's what they were end up doing. They took these people, they put them into these re-education camps or process or whatever that ended up looking like to teach them the ways of the Babylonian Empire, the culture, the language, the different gods that they worshiped. And that is where our friends find themselves. The leader of this empire, his name is Nebuchadnezzar. And when these guys were given a birth name of, there's Daniel, and then there's Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And through this, they lost even their birth names. They were given new names, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Daniel got to keep his. But that's where they find themselves in this spot of being under an authority that they didn't choose to be under, that they didn't get a chance to vote for. They found themselves in this captive space. Now, the leader, Nebuchadnezzar, he had ended up rising to power to being potentially one of the most powerful people on the earth at this time. And as they worshiped a bunch of gods, he considered himself to be almost like one of them. And so what he did was he ended up constructing this 90-foot tall statue made of gold. And anybody who's done anything great like that, you're probably going to have an unveiling party. But this was a party that you weren't really invited to, you were required to be at. And then also, it was something where he brought out the band, he brought out all of this, and he made a decree that when this music plays, that everybody needs to bow and to worship ultimately him, this statue that he has constructed. So that's where our guys come into play, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, because even though they had been in oppression, even though they had been captive, even though they were under an authority that they didn't agree with, that they didn't line up with, they worked really hard to understand the culture. They worked hard to understand the language. They worked hard at their jobs. And in fact, they rose in the ranks to even be part of Nebuchadnezzar's cabinet, kind of his advisor group. And now they find themselves at a crossroad because through all of that, they didn't compromise what Christ had called them to. And now they're at this crossroad where this music's supposed to play, they're supposed to bow, and they have to decide, are we going to continue on with the decision that we made to honor Christ, to obey him? Or are we going to let fear drive this decision, fear of this outcome, which had been announced to them that if you don't do this, you're going to get thrown into this fiery furnace that they ended up having. Well, they made this commitment, they're going to go all the way through, just like I kind of did with the cave. And so they've made this commitment that they're going to do this, and they couldn't bow because it would have broken at least 2 of the 10 commandments and probably more. And so they chose to stand strong, and this came back to Nebuchadnezzar. He saw that this had happened. And that's where we pick up this morning. This is in Daniel chapter 3. That was a really big, broad brushstroke summary of chapter 1 and 2. But in Daniel chapter 3, we're going to pick up in verse 13. And it says, "Furious with rage, Nebuchadnezzar summoned Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So these men were brought before the king, and Nebuchadnezzar said to them, 'Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the image of gold that I've set up? Now, when you hear the sound of all the instruments, if you are ready to fall down and worship the image I made, very good. But if you do not, you will be thrown immediately into a blazing furnace. Then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand?'" So I need to stop right here because they made a decision. And when we make decisions like this, we've got to be extra vigilant, especially right after we make the decision. Because there's almost always an opportunity for us to go back on that decision. Just like it was for me in the cave, as soon as it went black, I was like, okay, I think we're done here. But you guys have experienced this too. Pastor Rick will talk about different things, about being honest or being patient. And while you're sitting here in this chair, you wrestle with it, you think through it, you work with that, and you say, you know what, I'm gonna make a decision to be more patient. And then you take a right-hand turn here on 14th Street, and you get behind the slowest driver in all of Des Moines on a 50-mile-an-hour road. Or maybe you make it a little bit further, and then it's your spouse or your significant other or your kids, and your patience is instantly tested, and you're faced with that decision. Am I gonna still do what I said I was gonna do? Am I gonna continue in this decision, or is this where we jump off the path? Is this where we decide a different route? And we have to make that decision over and over and over again, but especially in ground zero, right after you've made that decision. I think it's important to be extra vigilant in that space. That's exactly what was happening with these guys. They've made their decision, and then they get the second chance, and they have to make the decision again. They have to re-up on that. The next verses that we're going to read, verse 16, it says this. It says, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they replied to him, to the king, 'King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we're thrown into the blazing furnace, the God that we serve is able to deliver us from it. He will deliver us from your majesty's hand, but even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your God or worship the image of gold that you've set up.'" So there's a couple things I want to point out in this passage. The first one is that they start off by telling the most powerful person in the area, we don't need to defend ourselves. They've spent all of this time having consistent actions throughout their captivity of still worshiping God, of still making these decisions, and still honoring the authority that was in place. And now they're at a point where words don't matter. Words do matter on a level, but when the rubber meets the road, it's what are the actions gonna be? It would have been super easy for me to say, you guys are doing great, while they're strapped up on the high ropes course. And then when it came for me to face my fear, I'd be like, you guys are doing great. But it goes so much further when our actions line up with what we've been saying. And that's where these guys were at. They said, we don't need to defend you because our actions we don't need to defend Christ. We don't need to defend this because our actions are gonna line up because we've made a decision that we're gonna go all the way. We're gonna obey and we're gonna be available to be used by God through this. However, the words that they do have here, I think, are pretty inspiring. They're pretty encouraging for me, and I hope they're encouraging for you. One of the words that I want to point out is it says right here, it says that the God that we serve is able to deliver us from this fire. I don't know about you, but that's a prayer that I've prayed because I believe in a God that can do miracles. I believe in a God who can do anything. And so I've prayed, God, I know you're able to deliver in this situation, in this fire. God, I know you're able to protect over here. God, I know you're able to heal over here. I think for all of us, we can kind of relate on that level, but that may be a faith 101 level because that still is at the lip service side of it. What does the next step look like though? The next step, I think we see a little bit more of their worldview maybe, of their perspective that they have, because they go on to say, we believe that he will deliver us from your hand. He is able to put out the fire. He is able to change Nebuchadnezzar's mind, but he goes a step further and says, they go a step further, they say, he will deliver. Maybe even thinking of, we'll be delivered from your hand one way or another. The fire may go out, or we may survive this, and that would be one way we would be delivered. Or maybe we're consumed by the fire, in which case they would still be delivered from his hand because their perspective goes beyond the years that we're given here on this earth. They're thinking on a more eternal scale. It's a perspective that you and I could end up having. But then they have the ultimate phrase here at the end. It says, but even if he does not, even if the fire doesn't go out, even if Nebuchadnezzar doesn't change his mind, even if this is the last thing that we do, we know that God is trustworthy. We know that God is faithful. And we're going to obey, and he's going to be honored, whether this is the last thing we do or whether we have more things to do after that, in everything, in life and in death. For me, this phrase is inspiring. It's encouraging. It's a faith that I would like to see in my own life. It's a faith that I pray over each and every one of you guys. Nebuchadnezzar didn't really agree. So the next verses here is verse 19. Nebuchadnezzar, he was furious with them and his attitude toward them changed. It went from bad to worse because he ordered the furnace to be heated 7 times hotter, and then he commanded some of the strongest soldiers of his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and to throw them into the blazing furnace. These guys made big statements of faith, ultimate statements of faith, potentially life-ending statements of faith. And then they followed it up with actions that mattered, actions that matched. And they stepped in or were thrown in to a fire. I don't know where you guys find yourselves at this morning. Maybe you're on the other side of these fires. Maybe you find yourself staring right at one. I don't know what your fire is. But I know that you guys can have a faith that'll allow you to take one more step. One of the things that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego did was they didn't do it alone. And we want to model that here within our church through small groups, through our church, but also through prayer. So we're going to have our prayer team come up during the songs, and maybe you have something that you're going through. We'd love to pray with you. We'd love to come alongside you. Maybe you've been through something. You want to celebrate that. We would love to do that as well. So our team will be available if you would like to come up during the songs. I'm going to come back up afterwards. We're going to talk about some steps we can take. What does it maybe look like to have that, but even if not, faith? Our friends, they took a big step in faith. They took a step that was an ultimate step. After saying some faith-filled words, they took some faith-filled steps. And I don't know about you, but this would have been the spot for me where I would have been waiting for God to come in with an awesome miracle, maybe even on my best day expecting it. This would be the moment where the king, he would have a change of heart. Man, he must be just really amazed at the step that we're taking. And so he's going to change his mind. Or maybe even like God could do a miracle and the fire would just go out. But that's not what happens. But that's the way I end up being. That's the way we end up being from time to time where, hey, God, I did my part. Now it's time for you to show up. Any minute now would be really, really great. But sometimes he doesn't show up in the ways that we would like for him to. And so where we left our boys was in the fire, and Nebuchadnezzar is sitting there expecting that they're going to be consumed by that fire. But as he looks in, he sees that that's not the case. They're standing there and they're just fine. And in fact, he sees a fourth being in that fire as well. And so that's where we're going to pick up. It's in verse 26, and it says this. It says, Nebuchadnezzar then approached the opening of the blazing furnace, and he shouted, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here. So they came out of the fire, and everyone that was around there at the time, they gathered around, and they saw that that the fire had not harmed their bodies, nor was a single hair on their heads singed. Their robes were not scorched, and there was no smell of fire on them. Then Nebuchadnezzar said, Praise be to God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who sent his angel and rescued his servants. They've trusted him, and they defied the king's command and were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own. See, up until this point, I think it would have been easy for them to say, where is God? What's going on? Why are we still going through this? And kind of like us, where I could say, why isn't the fire going out? Why isn't God showing up? But he does show up. He was with them. And that's the encouragement that I want to bring for you guys this morning, is that God is with you through whatever that fire is that you may be going through. It's not like any of us here are necessarily facing an actual fiery furnace, but you might say, Brandon, if you knew what I was going through, I might as well be. If you knew the addiction and the relapse that I keep having in my life, if you knew the struggle with infertility, if you knew the anxiety, the stress, the frustrations that I go through, I might as well be, and I feel pretty alone, and I want to say that God's with you this morning. I am a self-proclaimed Grinch. I was just talking about it with someone this morning. My heart is two sizes too small. But I think it might be growing a little bit on me this year around Christmas time especially as I've worked through this sermon and this point exactly that God is with you. Because as you're going to see on signs around the Christmas season, as we've already sung about today, one of the first names given to Jesus was Emmanuel, which means God with us. Which means he is, as we see his name as we see that name, that message is being preached. We can be reminded that God is with us, that he came here to this earth to be with us, that he went through fires and trials just like us, but he defeated them and made a way for us to be able to get through it. Now, these fires aren't any fun. And to be quite honest, one of the things I like about American culture is the comfort and the ease that it seems to go about. And I would love to not have to be in any of these fires or be in any of these trials. But they're also not all bad. Some good comes out of them. Scripture tells us that that's how ways that our faith grows. But sometimes other things happen in fires too. And it's something we might notice here. If we notice with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in their story, they went into the fire tied up, bound in ropes. But they came out of the fire without those ropes. They came out of the fire free, able to move about, able to do what it is that God called them to do. And I think sometimes in our lives, some of the trials, some of the fires that we go through can help in removing some of the things that we don't need in our life. When we find ourselves in some of these really messy circumstances, oftentimes the most important things rise to the surface. The distractions kind of start to fall away a little bit. Pastor Rick talks about like, oh, you've slept once since then, so we need to make sure we have a reminder. I want to give you a reminder that goes all the way back to where we started this year. Almost 330 days ago, Pastor Rick did a sermon series called Resolve. We were talking about resolutions, and he challenged us. He said, if you show up if you dig in, if you put these things into practice, we as a church are going to come through this year as changed people. We're going to see God work in our lives, in our families, in our marriages, in the world around us. And he jumped off of this passage in Hebrews that I want us to look back at here. And it's Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 1. And it says, therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses. That was a bunch of people who made some big faith steps that just got done talked about and being talked about in Hebrews 11. People like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They made these big steps, and he said, this person, they made this step by faith because they took the next step. They were obedient with one more step, and because they did, this happened and that happened. And it's a really cool timeline to be able to see these different moments where people made these tough decisions. But he says, but therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles. Let us run with perseverance the race that's marked out for us. So sometimes the fires aren't all bad. Sometimes rather than us having to take off those things that are hindering, those things that are distracting, those things that are slowing us down, sometimes, whether we like it or not, whether we chose to or not, those things are removed through some of the fires, through some of the trials that we go through. So fires aren't all bad, and God is with us through them. There's another parallel I want to draw here and connect it to steps that you and I can take, or reminders that we can have as we take hope in the midst of the trials and the things that we're in. And that is that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they didn't look like, or they didn't smell like what they had been through. They didn't look like they had been through a fire. The crowd came around. They looked. There was no singed hair. Their robes were fine. There was no smell of smoke on their bodies. They didn't look like they had just been through a fire. This happens pretty often in my family. We'll go out and we'll be at a park or we'll be out somewhere. And if there is a pile of dog poo somewhere at this park, my kids will step in it. I promise you. I've got enough kids where one of them's going to step in it for sure. And you get back to the car and all of a sudden, and it's an all-out search because we can smell what someone has been through. And we're checking the bottom of our own shoes. We're checking the bottom of their shoes. We've got to get to the bottom of this because you can know exactly where they've been because they smell like it. But that's not necessarily the case with the trials that you and I go through. Because when we go through these with Christ, when we go through these with faith, when we go through these taking one step in obedience at a time, the people around us are going to see God in us. We're tempted to want to carry that label of the trauma that I've been through or whatever it was that you've gone through. We want to carry that label and almost like a scarlet letter say, this is who I am. But God says, no, you're someone else. Nebuchadnezzar did the same thing. They came, they looked, they said, where's the fire? Where's the evidence of a fire? And they saw Jesus. They saw God, the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Paul talks about this as well. It's in 2 Corinthians. He talks about a physical trial, a fire, you could say, in his life as well, where he had this some kind of a physical ailment. They called it a thorn in his flesh, and he prayed several times for God to remove it. And like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, his fire didn't go out. But he wrote down in chapter 12, verse number 9, what God did say. He said, my grace is sufficient for you. I've given you the strength to take one more step. I've given you the strength to be available to be used by me. I've given you the strength to be obedient in this situation. But then he goes on further, and this is where we're getting to. He says that my power is made perfect in your weakness. When people look at you, they're not going to see the issues. They're not going to see the physical things. They're not going to see the trial. They're not going to see the fires that you've been through. When you go through this with faith, they're going to see me. They're going to be compelled to see someone that you've put your trust in, that you've put your faith in as you've gone through these trials. So what do we do with all of this? Where are we headed? These are encouraging. It's helpful. What is the thing that you and I can do? I think as we're at the end of the year, I'm just warning you, Pastor Rick's probably going to be talking about resolutions for 2025. So prepare yourself. You got a few weeks of Christmas. That's our little gap there. But he's probably going to be talking about what are we going to do next year? Because we're not just done after 2024. We're going to continue on. So try to take some time and let's reflect where we've been this last year, where we're headed this next year. And maybe ask yourself a really tough question. Where's my focus? What am I focused on? I want to go back to Hebrews 12, where we started the year, 330 days ago. Hebrews 12, we read verse 1. I want to continue on. It says, so we're going to throw off everything that hinders, the sin that so easily entangles us, and let's run with perseverance the race that's marked out for us. This is the part that can give us faith that can go through any fire. Fixing our eyes on Jesus. Not just because it sounds like a good idea, not just because he was a great guy that once upon a time lived and there was some cool books that were written about him, but because he pioneered and perfected this faith that we're talking about. For the joy that was set before him, he endured the cross. He endured the fire because his eyes were fixed on his Father, and because the joy that was set before him was how much he loves each and every one of us. And so he endured the cross. Scorning its shame, he sat down at the right hand at the throne of God. Consider him. Focus on him, who endured such opposition from sinners so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. I was talking with someone this week, and I got so frustrated because I feel like we can have these moments, usually right on the other side of a trial, right on the other side of a fire, where I'm like, man, I am locked in. Like, God is my God. I've got faith that can move mountains. I can go step in a fiery furnace, whatever it is. And then like 2 days passes, and I just like kind of forget about that. And I kind of get frustrated at the slow driver on 14th Street or whatever it is. I just totally, my eyes just shift right back into me, right back into my outcomes. And then I start getting filled with fear, and I don't move. I have no action because I'm just frozen in fear and like, what's the outcome going to be? How is this going to work out? Or maybe then I find myself just overwhelmed with anxiety and stress and just wringing my hands about what's to come. Or maybe even I find myself doubting, God, are you going to show up? God, do you hear me? God, are you even real? And so I feel like if we fix our eyes on him, if we focus on him, if we have these reminders in our life to be able to come back to him, I think it changes a couple things in our mindset. One of those is, instead of worrying about if God is able and if he can do something, I think we start to think about what we can control. Am I available? Because while these faith steps of all these guys in Hebrews 11, while they did amazing, amazing things, the one thing that they all did was they were available. And that's someone that God can use. And that's something that every single person in this room can do, is sit and focus on, am I available to be used by God? Or is fear going to drive my decision? Is my anxiety going to drive my decision? Is my frustrations, my feelings going to drive my decisions? And then our perspective shifts. Not that it's all roses and I have no concern about the outcomes whatsoever, because Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were humans just like us, and I'm sure they were concerned about the outcome on some level, but more so they were concerned about their obedience. This is a hard situation, but we can be obedient. Not jumping all the way to the end where we get to step out of the fire and say, woo, we did it. But what does it look like to take one more step through this journey? One more step through this difficult time. One more step through this good time that we're going in. And as we become people who are available, people who are obedient, God's going to work through us. We're going to continue what we started back at the beginning of the year, where we're going to see change in our lives, change in our families, change in our neighborhoods. God's going to end up using each and every one of us. So let's remember that God's with us through whatever that trial is that we're going through. It doesn't define you. God defines you. He calls you his child, and he calls you loved. He calls for your obedience to take that very next step, that next faith-filled step in your life. God, thank you so much for loving us. Not being a God who just said all these things in theory and did all these things out of novel and the story, but that you came here to be with us, that you lived this life, that you endured the cross. And because you defeated that cross, God, I am overwhelmed with the fact that we know that we can also see victory through whatever the trials are that we're going through in our life. And so I just pray over each person in this room, pray over people tuning in online, God, that you make yourself known in their situations. Make yourself known right where they're at so that they have the faith, that they have the courage to take one more step in their situation, one more step through you. And God, I know that you will be honored and that you will be seen in our lives. God, make yourself known in our lives so that we can bring your kingdom here on earth. In your name we pray. Amen.